yes, but people who look at things differently, who have a different angle on life and on the issues particularly. So we need to be careful that we aren't afraid of advice. And I think sometimes people are afraid of advice because some people think things through pretty deeply themselves. And so they've thought it through pretty deeply and wrestled through a lot of thoughts and a lot of different options and arguments and come to some conclusions. And then a little bit nervous about getting advice because the advice might contradict those conclusions, and then what do you do with that and how do you interact with those advisors? But we don't want to be afraid of advice because you don't have to follow the other person's advice. You don't have to do what they tell you to do. But it is wisdom to hear it and then to take it before God and to consider it. And there's also the aspect, when Emilio Lopez was here a few weeks ago, he shared this, that he wanted to have, and Emilio was on the church staff at that time, so he wanted to have the blessing of his pastors, Adele and Cesar Lopez, as well as, obviously, the agreement of his wife, he said, and then he wanted to hear clearly from God. And so Hebrews 13:17 says this, have confidence in your leaders and act under their authority. They're watching over you because they're responsible for your souls. And so there's an aspect in which there are significant spiritual leaders in our lives. And I'm not necessarily saying it's the pastor who's up front, or that any spiritual leader has the right to tell someone yes or no, you can do this or you can't do this. That's not like that. But you have a small group leader, and you're trying to make some big decisions. Well, go to your small group leader, talk to him about it, or her about it. Get their input, get them praying with you about that. That's a spiritual, someone in spiritual oversight in my life, in your life. Or you're serving on a team and you have a team leader. Or you just have someone who has played a very large role in your life. They've discipled you, they've advised you over the years, and they're more than a friend. And it's one thing to count the advice from friends and others that you don't know so well. It's another thing when you have a significant person like that in your life. You go to them for advice and counsel, and the advice and counsel that they give is really significant. I remember when I went through my ordination council years ago. Back in those days, the thinking was they would always ask you in these councils, what if we don't approve you for ordination? And the answer that was typically kind of desired to be heard was that the person being examined would say, well, I'm going to preach the gospel anyway because God's called me to it and I don't need man's approval. And I really thought through that because I knew they were going to ask me that question. And so when they asked me that question, and they said, what are you going to do if we don't approve you? I said, I'll find something else to do with my life. Because you guys know me. And if you aren't going to ordain me, if you aren't going to say, yeah, go ahead with this, then it would be foolish of me to then go off on my own. And so there's a sense in which there are significant people in our lives, and we don't necessarily have to have their permission. I maybe was even a little extreme in my thinking on that in those days. I don't know, but there is a sense in which the significant people, we want to have their blessing and their support and their encouragement. So go for advice. But fifthly, be realistic and count the cost. There's a price tag for everything. Decide to get a cup of coffee, there's a price tag for that. It's not just the cost of the coffee, but you're spending time that you will never get back. Anything we do, at the very least, we are spending time on it that we will never be able to recover. There is always a price tag for everything that we do in life. And we need to count the cost. Proverbs 20:25 says, it is a trap for a man to dedicate something rashly and only later consider his vows or her vows. And so that's talking about dedicating something to be offered to God in the Old Testament worship system, and then later finding out, wow, I thought this coin was only worth $100, and I find out it's worth $20,000, but I've already committed to giving it. It says we want to count the cost ahead of time. And that's one of the reasons we want to get the facts. It's a trap if we decide before we have really deliberated and considered the cost that is going to be involved in forging ahead. Jesus said this in John 14:28 and 29. He says, don't begin until you count the cost, for who would begin construction of a building without first calculating the cost to see if there's enough money to finish it? Otherwise, you might complete only the foundation before running out of money, and then everyone would laugh at you. And so Jesus was saying that there, as far as following him, he's saying, okay, there's going to be a cost to this, and you're better off not starting than starting and then quitting a third of the way through. Did you ever hear the story about the guy that was... I grew up beside a river. This joke just popped in my mind. We were just back home a week or so ago. This is a pretty wide river, 300 yards wide, and the joke was it was a guy that tried to swim the river. He got halfway across and realized he couldn't make it, so he turned around and swam back. Okay. You don't want to be like that. We don't want to get part of the way there and then, we can't make it. So we have to count the cost. We have to give serious thought to the relational cost, financial, emotional, pain and hardship, loneliness, whatever might fit into the whole process. And then finally, face our fears. And for that, we need to go to God for courage. It really is so often fear that causes us to hesitate. It's fear of failure. It's fear of inadequacy. It's fear of not having enough. It's fear of not knowing enough that causes us to hold back and not to even take initial beginning steps in the direction of fulfilling our dreams. And Moses had the excuse, I can't talk in front of people. And so Moses had that excuse. Gideon, in the Old Testament, he had the excuse he was too young. On and on the list can go of people who made excuses about their lives and why they couldn't pursue what God had for them, the dream for them. So, for me and for you, what's my excuse? And what's the excuse? It's too risky. What if it doesn't work out? What am I going to do then with my life? I don't have the time. I don't have the money. I don't have the experience, the education. I don't have the contacts or the resources. If I were only married, I could do this. Or if I were only not married, I could do this. On and on the list can go. But we have to face our fears and realize that life is never perfect. In fact, 2 Timothy 1:7 tells us God's not given us a spirit of fear, but a spirit of power and of love and of a sound mind. And so we can overcome our fears. In fact, the context there is this, that Paul had just told Timothy, stir up the gifts in you. Use your gifts, Timothy. Fulfill your potential, because God's not given us a spirit of fear. You don't have to hang back. You don't have to be afraid. And so we need to forge ahead, face our fears. Best thing to do with a fear is face it. And just take steps to face it. And face it with God's courage and with God's power. And we see then that God will carry us through it. Now that last passage I have in your notes and on the screen here, my encouragement to you is take that home, just read it. Just read through it and just say, God, make this real in my life. Say, God, I want to open my heart to you. Make these truths real in my life. And then read through it a line at a time and pray that back to God. God, take this and make it true in me. So, what do? Well, we have to adjust our hearts to humility. We have to begin to seek God's wisdom and guidance. We have to gather information, get the facts. We have to get advice and input from others so we gain perspective of what's next. We do have to count the cost and be realistic. And then we have to confront and face our fears with God's courage. And as we do this, faith grows within us. Our faith is strengthened because we're moving in the track that God created us to move in. We're going to worship now, so the worship team's going to make their way down. And as we worship, these songs are all designed really to be prayers. Just about all of them are designed to be prayers. And so we sing these prayers to God. And my encouragement to you is make these songs your song. Make the words your words. And as you do that, the Holy Spirit's going to do something powerful in your heart and in your life. And God changes us when we worship because we're focused on Him. and we're thinking about Him rather than thinking about ourselves. Hey, ushers are going to come down too. We're going to receive